Good morning to one and all. I am K.Sujatha, Associate Professor of Commerce, Sita Lakshmi Ramasamy College. In this video, I am going to discuss about working capital management, a topic from the subject financial management. Capital required for a firm can be classified into two types, namely fixed capital and number two, working capital. Fixed capital may be stated as the capital required for purchase of fixed assets like land, building, machinery, office equipments, etc. So these fixed assets are used for undertaking continuous production activity and they are not intended for resale. By using these fixed assets, the organization ensures production activity in such a way that there is no disturbances at any point of time. And these fixed assets involve huge amount of resources which can be raised by long-term sources, namely shares and debentures. Number 2, working capital. Working capital refers to the capital that is required to meet the day-to-day expenses of the firm, namely payment of salaries, purchase of raw materials, purchase of spare parts, components, etc. And the amount of capital required is comparatively very slow, and this is met by current assets. And the next one, concepts of working capital. Two concepts of working capital, namely gross working capital, number 2, net working capital. Gross working capital refers to the total investment in current assets. Current assets we refer to those assets which offer greater liquidity, that is convertibility into cash. Examples are inventory, bills receivable, cash in hand, cash at bank, etc. So according to the gross working according to the gross working capital concept, total investment in current assets is the working capital. Number 2, net working capital. Net working capital refers to the difference between total current assets and total current liabilities. Current assets, as we see, it is the total investment in assets which can be easily convertible into cash, and current liabilities refer to those claims which are to be met within a shorter period of time, namely creditors, bank loan, bills payable, etc. So the difference between current assets and current liabilities will give you the net working capital, and this working capital may be positive or negative. When the level of current assets exceeds current liabilities, we will be having a positive net working capital. When the current liabilities exceeds current assets, it will result in unfavorable working capital, namely negative working capital. It is always advisable for a company to maintain this positive working capital. Next, we are going to see about the types of working capital. So, number 1, permanent or fixed working capital. Number 2, temporary or variable working capital. So, from the name itself, we can understand permanent or fixed working capital refers to that level of working capital which is required by every firm to be maintained to ensure continuous production. So that level has to be constantly maintained by that organization to have continuous production. Example, investment in stock in the form of raw materials to a certain level has to be maintained so that at any stage production is not stopped. And number 2, temporary or variable working capital. From the name itself we can understand that is the level of working capital that is required over and above the permanent working capital is called temporary or variable working capital. Next, we are going to see about the operating cycle. So, operating cycle refers to the time gap that is between the cash that is put into the business and again the realization of cash. So the various processes to be undertaken are conversion of cash into raw materials, number 2, conversion of raw materials into work in progress, number 3, conversion of work in progress into finished goods, number 4, conversion of finished goods into sales, which takes the form of credit sale, and again realization of cash from the debtors. So all these stages are referred to as the operating cycle, and the time gap is to be called as the period of operating cycle. Greater the period of operating cycle, greater will be the requirement for working capital. And next we'll discuss about the importance of working capital. Importance number 1, to ensure adequate production, it is essential to have, importance of working capital. Number 1, to have continuous production, it is essential to have adequate amount of working capital. Number 2, solvency and goodwill. In order to maintain solvency, that is prompt payment of amount of settled to be settled to the creditors, again it is essential to have continuous production, for which continuous and adequate amount of working capital is required. When the firm is able to pay prompt payment to the creditors, automatically that will improve the goodwill of the concern. And number 3, with regard to payment to the outsiders, claims of the outsiders, if to be settled promptly and properly, adequate working capital is required. Number 4, easy loans. Whenever the firm wants to raise loans from banks and financial institutions, they must be able to expose a favorable situation about the firm, for which they must be able to have adequate amount of working capital. Terms of purchase and terms of sales. Depending upon the level of working capital maintained and required by the organization, they will be able to facilitate the terms of purchase and terms of sales. Also, seasonal fluctuations whenever arises can also be handled properly if adequate amount of working capital is maintained by the organization. And the concern will be able to face crisis at any situation when they are having adequate working capital, and day-to-day activities are undertaken without any problem and disturbances. These are the point of importance to be considered from a concerns point of view regarding a maintenance of adequate working capital. Next we'll discuss about the factors influencing working capital. We'll discuss about the main points. Number 1, nature of business. The nature of business to a greater extent determines the amount of working capital. For example, in the case of public utility concerns like electricity corporations, then railways, etc., they have to invest more amount of money in the form of fixed assets, whereas day-to-day cash transactions are less. So their requirement for working capital will be less and requirement for fixed capital will be high. On the other hand, in the case of trading concerns and manufacturing concerns, where they undertake the production activity or where they do the activity of buying the finished products and selling to the customers, requirement for working capital will be high. So the nature to a greater extent determines a requirement for working capital. Number 2, size of the business. When the size of the business concern happens to be a large one, requirement for working capital also will be high. If the size happens to be a medium or a smaller one, requirement will also be considerably less. And number 3, terms of sales. If liberal credit policy is allowed to the debtors in order to make sales, greater will be the amount held up in the form of stock, which will result in more amount of working capital requirement. If strict credit policy is followed and cash sales is preferred, requirement for working capital will be less. Similarly, seasonal fluctuations. Some products have demand only during certain seasons and their production will be undertaken during certain periods, and demand for working capital will be high during such times, and the demand for working capital during the off seasons will be comparatively less. Example, we can say demand for umbrellas, raincoats, etc., which are only for a shorter period of time. Next one, time consumed in manufacture. The period or the operating cycle also determines the level of working capital. That is the time taken for the production activity. If it happens to be very high, automatically requirement for working capital also will be high. And if the operating cycle happens to be less, the requirement for working capital will be also less. And the next one is labor intensive versus capital intensive industries. Whenever the firm is following labor intensive production, that is giving more importance to labor efforts, automatically the requirement for working capital will be high, because payment of wages has to be paid regularly. On the other hand, when the firm concentrates on machines, fixed assets instead of labor, the requirement for working capital will be less and the requirement for fixed capital will be high. Next one, growth and expansion of business. Firms which expects for continuous growth and expansion will be required to maintain adequate amount of working capital always, and their requirement will be high. Those firms which do not give importance to growth and expansion aspect, their requirement for working capital will be comparatively less. Next one, operating efficiency. If the firm is able to undertake its activities in an effective and efficient manner, the requirement for working capital will be comparatively less, and if the operating efficiency is not up to the expected mark, the level of requirement of working capital will be comparatively lesser. So apart from this, we also have many factors. These are the important factors to be considered for estimating the working capital requirements. And in conclusion, we can very well say any firm which is undertaking the production activity must always make an estimate of what is the working capital required to undertake the production activity in a continuous manner, and these are all points are to be considered properly for determining the same. Thank you.